Today, there is an emerging conversation that is short of criminality, that is pervading the public space about genetically modified organisms. And in this context that the conversation is coming, it appears somebody from outside of our countries has some business interest in one way or more to push some products for wealth accumulation and at the same time ensure an agenda of depopulation on the masses of these so-called poor countries. It started some time ago, the movement for biotechnology to intercept the food production chain. And in doing so, engineer and re-engineer the genome, the DNA of crops, of plants, to introduce some completely unique components, traits, and to some extent delete or cut off some so-called undesirable traits. That's what's happening with genetic modification. And in doing so, they are producing some crops. Initially, it started like something for the animals, something for the fuel, biofuel, biodiesel industry, alternative fuel. And at that time, there was this argument that never worry, these plants, these crops are just being engineered to bring in more grains on the table, because at that time, soybeans was majorly used in the United States for the production of biodiesel. It's a chemical process of esterification that converts the oils into diesel and some other byproducts that are used in the pharmaceutical industry and cosmetic industry. Now, the agenda was masked, and a lot of people fell for it. And soybeans began to be mass-produced in the United States through the technology of genetic engineering. And the moment that came on board, with all the various challenges that many other speakers are talking about, I want to focus. I'm traditionally a chemist. I research and teach on concepts that border on agrochemicals. So I will focus on that for this discourse for the next few minutes. Why the production of soybeans, and eventually it moved to maize. Sorry, can I stand up, please? I like to stand up. Why the production of soybeans and eventually moved to maize was going on, something else was coming into the table, coming onto the table of consumers. The agrochemicals that were used in the process of farming were crossing from the agricultural field onto the table of consumers as food. And certain things began to happen. Health hazards, some risk began to show up. Now I want to take you down the lane of some little bit of chemistry. Please endure with me because you need it. A lot of what happens on your food is chemical. In a way, natural chemical. But what's happening is, as they introduced biotechnology, bioengineering to alter the traits, the DNA of those plants that were producing the food crops, they were advertising certain traits. One was increased yield. Number two was the herbicide resistance. Number three was disease resistance. Number four was drought tolerance. What that meant was the very companies, the very promoters of these genetically modified foods or organisms were the same companies that were producing the chemicals that we used on our agricultural fields, the agrochemicals. There is something in research we call conflict of interest. So in this case, because it appeared as though it was a global, or these powerful manufacturers were capturing the political landscape across the world, the context of conflict of interest was pushed under the table. These manufacturers of these poisons were the same manufacturers, or they're the same promoters of genetic engineering to alter the genes of these crops that we are eating. So what happened was, I'll take one of the traits, herbicide resistance. Something happened. Before now, if a farmer in Africa, for example, goes to his field or her field and sees that the weeds are competing with the crops, some will use the cutlass, some would use the hoe, or some will pull out the weeds. So they came with these chemicals, one of the presenters, the speakers, mentioned atrazine. It's also a herbicide. They came with glyphosate, which you commonly know it in the market as Roundup. Of course, glyphosate is in fact, is the major active ingredient of Roundup. The major active ingredient of Roundup. So what they did was, when a farmer applied atrazine or glyphosate, some of the crops will also be affected. So it was the money limiting link. It was the profit limiting link for the consumption of those herbicides. So that was actually the ace up their sleeve. They wanted to up their profits in the agrochemicals. But farmers were applying the agrochemicals and the crops were also dying. So they came up to engineer the plants so that the plants will be resistant to the herbicides. And that is how GM soybean, GM maize, including the one that some people in our leadership structure ignorantly are pushing in the name of Tailor maize. And they are telling the farmer, they are telling the public that you will get more money. I teach and supervise graduate students at a World Bank-sponsored Center of Excellence for Food Technology and Research. And that center is focused on mitigating post-harvest losses for farmers. Now, what they're trying to do is tell the farmers that you get more money, and the farmers will jump at the carrot. And there is a stick embedded in the carrot, and this is the stick. The genetically modified maize, your Tailor maize, or your RR soy, that is Roundup resistant soybean, has been engineered with a gene that breaches the physiological process in the plant that responds to the herbicide, which ordinarily is a very toxic chemical. So the plant now becomes resistant to Roundup, becomes resistant to glyphosate, becomes resistant to atrazine or whatever they push into the market. Now the farmer comes on now with this new herbicide, applies it to the field, all the grass, all the weed dies, dries up, and the plant is still standing. Now, glyphosate is an organophosphate. In the field of agrochemicals, we had two broad classes, organochlorines and organophosphates. If you are old enough that you heard about DDT, dichlorodiethyl trichloroethane. It falls into the class of chemicals that are environmentally persistent and recalcitrant to degradation. So there are different channels of environmental degradation. Some are degraded by sunlight, we call it photodegradation. Some are degraded in the water. But DDT, which was an organochlorine, was persisting in water bodies, and you remember your gamalin 20, killing fishes and other amphibious organisms. Now, they banned DDT. For about 20 years, DDT was still being used in Africa, in Nigeria. And unfortunately, farmers, fishermen were using it to kill fishes and bring the fishes to the table. So, what now happened was, with this Roundup resistant, genetically modified soybeans and maize, farmers felt more at liberty to apply more herbicides. But something else was also happening at the same time. Because nature is designed by God to operate in a certain way. Suddenly, the weeds began to resist the herbicide, necessitating for farmers to apply more herbicide, increasing the concentration, increasing the dosage, and another chemical pathway that we know, it's called metabolization. In the environment, the chemical or agrochemical species the farmer introduces ordinarily is supposed to metabolize, degrade. But as you increase the concentration, some residues will not metabolize because of higher concentration. It's a natural law of physics. Then something else was also happening. The organochlorines that were banned, the DDTs, the gamalin 20 that were banned, they were not metabolizing in the environment, they were persistent. But for the organophosphates, which glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup that is so ubiquitous all across African nations, amongst farmers today, when it breaks down, the active metabolites are more toxic than the initial agrochemical. That's what is happening. So when rain falls, these metabolites run off into surface water bodies. And has anybody inquired why, since how many years from independence, Nigeria, as a case study, many cities in Nigeria have problem with potable water. Many villages, many cities, people drink from surface water or groundwater. And if you study the translocation of chemicals in the soil, it goes down. So groundwater sources became polluted, surface water bodies became polluted, and for example, the soybean and the maize, the tissue of the plant lacks the ability to completely metabolize Roundup because it picks it up. As you spray it on the crop, it picks it up. So what am I trying to paint? I'm painting a picture of how this thing moves from the field to the table, as to your breakfast or dinner table. And then suddenly, we began to see things like a spread of, when I was growing up, I was told that diabetes was a disease of old people. I was told that hypertension was a disease of very wealthy people who had several businesses and they are thinking of so many things. Until I began to visit the dialysis centers and I saw 12-year-olds, teenagers with type 2 diabetes. It's as a result of the hormonal, because diabetes, for example, prostate enlargement, what they call benign prostate hyperplasia, there are changes in the endocrine system. Dr. Maka is here. You can attest to that. Changes in the endocrine system, testosterone, progesterone, estrogen, which is implicated in some cancer cell lines in breast cancer. So Roundup has the tendency to distort the endocrinology of the animal, including humans. There are a lot of case studies. I have documents. Scientific, validated investigations. Hundreds of scientific papers. At the right time, anybody, any of the media houses, if you're interested, we can push it to you. So that you can tell Nigerians, tell the government, tell the consumers, tell the farmers that we, the scientists, have carried out investigations and these are our findings. So basically, what we are talking about in genetically modified food goes beyond the genetic engineering in the laboratory. It actually is a narrative of pumping toxic chemicals into the environment. So it's not just your grains that they are genetically modifying, it's also your menu. The chemicals that are supposed to sustain these crops, because there are super weeds now, as a result of Roundup-resistant maize, Roundup-resistant soya, super weeds are coming. Now, if you go to the field, farmers are no longer using only Roundup. They are mixing it together with some other cocktail, so to be able to kill the weeds. Now, that is the picture that we face. And in conclusion, any society that terminates the future of its young is entering into a termination stage. So it means young people, males, will become infertile. Young people, women, females, will have cervical cancers, breast cancers, and infertility. And it also means people's life expectancy, like in Nigeria today, the life expectancy of males is 54, 55. The one for females is 58. So that is what is facing us. And my submission to the general public is you need to intentionally ask the right questions. Ask questions to the food vendor that is selling food to you. Ask questions to your representatives in the political houses. Ask questions to us, scientists, to tell you what we are doing in the laboratories. Because it's not all about money. It's about population reduction. Thank you.